Hi, this is Josh Kulp. We are learning Daf Shevui. We are learning Masechet Kiddushin Daf Kaf Daled, page 24. Most of this daf deals with a law from Exodus 21 that if a master strikes his slave, the slave goes free if the master causes a loss of shein or ayin, of tooth or eye. Just I want to make a couple words about the biblical context of this and how it helps us explain the rabbinic discussion. The rabbinic discussion is mostly about is it just the eye or the tooth, or is it other limbs as well? If the master causes irreparable loss or some kinds of loss of other parts of the slave's body, do those also send the slave free? Which parts of the body? And if it's other parts of the body, why does the Torah only mention ayin v'shein, or shein v'ayin, the tooth and the eye? So I think that just looking at the biblical context gives us another easy explanation for why the Torah mentions dafka, the eye, and the tooth. Besides the very obvious fact that it is very easy to put out an eye or a tooth, it's a little harder to chop off somebody's hand or their foot or their leg. Those things don't come off so easily. But the context helps us understand this a lot, that Exodus 21 from, let's say, verse 22 and verse 23. Verse 22 and verse 23 deal with a person who accidentally strikes another person. I'm not going to get into the exact context, but a regular person, not master-slave relationship, who accidentally strikes another person and causes either loss of life or loss of limb. And so the Torah quite clearly says, if there's a loss of life, then v'natata nefesh tachat nefesh. You should give life for life. Ayin tachat ayin, shen tachat shen, yad tachat yad, regel tachat ragel. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So this is the eye for an eye famous law, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but we see here that the first two parts of the body that are mentioned are the eye and the tooth. And then that's the context in which we get the slave law. Verse 26 says, if a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let him go free on account of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let him go free on account of his tooth. So the reason why shein and ayin are mentioned here is probably because they're the first two that are mentioned on the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth law, and it's just the Bible is just continuing on with the same biblical context. It seems very doubtful to me that the Torah meant to say only for an eye and only for a tooth, and not for a hand or not for a foot, but rather that just is simply that this is the way these lists were generated or developed, that the eye and tooth are the first two examples in both lists. And that's what leads the rabbis to have to discuss something that's not there in the Torah. Well, which other limbs? What about tips of certain limbs? What about, we're going to get a long discussion eventually on castration. We're going to get a long discussion on the tongue. Do these count as limbs like an eye or a tooth, or are they somehow different, mostly because they're not exposed? So we'll have some of those discussions later on, but I thought it was just interesting to refresh our minds of the biblical context so that we can better understand the rabbinic discussion.